of our attendees for joining, and big thank you to Bob for being here with us tonight. So just as a reminder to those of you who do not know, and an announcement for those of, or a reminder to those of you who do know, an announcement for those of you who do not know, we at CRES aspire to support a 100% renewable Colorado through education, engagement, and connection to networking opportunities across all of our Denver communities. And we very much appreciate your support in this mission. CRES is a statewide nonpartisan organization, and we are just one of 5 chapters that are putting on great educational content to the Colorado community and beyond. So thank you so much for being here. Tonight, I'm going to go through a series of chapter announcements, and then I will introduce our speaker and then turn it over to Bob for our feature presentation tonight. Throughout the presentation, feel free to type questions into the question box. You should be able to see that on your screen, and we will answer those throughout the presentation. So I'll feel free to ask them to Bob, and he'll shout out some answers. If we do have more questions at the end, we of course will save time for Q&A if we can, but feel free to ask throughout as things pop up throughout. If you would like to become a member, we would love to have you as part of CRES. Feel free to learn more about CRES and check out our membership options at www.cres-energy.org. And we want to hear your feedback. It's been almost a year since we've seen many of you in person, and we know that means that there's less opportunity for each of you to share your thoughts and your feedback about CRES in general, or our speaker series, and people who you'd like to see and speakers who you'd like to see in our speaker series. So please feel free to email us with feedback, with anything you might have to say. We would love to hear it. MDCRES@cres-energy.org is the best place to reach our steering committee. And if you would like to further support us, in addition to becoming a member, you can also support us by donating. So you can do so at the CRES website. You can make a Venmo donation, or if you guys are still online shopping a lot during this COVID time, you can change your charity of choice to CRES when you buy on Amazon Smile, and a percentage of your of the cost of your item will go towards supporting us. So thank you for considering that. And the next announcement that we have is to go solar and or volunteer to support solar with the Solar United Neighbors Co-op. So they have a 30 million solar homes goal, in addition with several other groups such as the Initiative for Energy Justice and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And this goal is in hopes to address climate change and the economic downturn and social injustice by broadening access to on-site solar and community solar. So we're very, very excited to be to have a partnership with Solar United Neighbors. Actually, I myself am awaiting the solar for my home next week. Solar United Neighbors has helped me hook this up, so we're going to be a solar-powered home next week. They've been wonderful to work with, and they need help not just by having people sign up to become a solar home, but also through volunteer efforts to hang door hangers around the community to make more people aware. If you are interested in supporting Solar United Neighbors on their solar efforts, please email Bryce Carter. His email address is bcarter@solarunitedneighbors.org. He'll give you a lot more information if you're interested in pursuing solar or if you're interested in helping to support their volunteer efforts. And with that, I will turn it over to Johnny for his policy update.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Hey everyone, Johnny Rogers, the policy director for the CRES Denver chapter. So in national news this week, y'all may have heard about widespread power outages in Texas. And you also may have heard that frozen wind turbines have been blamed for those blackouts. Well, actually, when you actually talk to the experts and the state officials responsible for managing the power grid, it seems like malfunctions in gas operations have actually played the largest role. And unfortunately, this was avoidable a decade ago. After another winter storm, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had recommended to ERCOT, the electric system operator in Texas, that they should take steps to weatherize some of their systems to ensure that they could operate in cold weather. In case something like this happened again, those actions were not taken, and now we're seeing pretty catastrophic failures in fossil fuel and other energy system infrastructures across the state. Unfortunately, the climate crisis is likely to trigger more of these events in the future. We now have things like wildfires to contend with in California and Colorado and other parts of the country, as well as these freak winter events. And we need to be really thoughtful about what are the steps that we're going to take to ensure that we are prepared and more resilient in the future. There's a great article from Colorado Public Radio that I'm sure you can find if you Google it, amongst many other articles about what's going on in Texas right now, but highlighting things like more local generation, having really energy efficient electric heating, or as we shift our energy systems towards electrification, these are solutions that can help us respond to these more extreme weather events and continue to keep ourselves warm and our cities powered in these types of occurrences. Next slide, please. So the state legislature is back in session, and already a few energy-related bills have hit the floor. The first one is effectively helping to fast-track transmission investments, things that can help prepare the state to connect to regional transmission organizations, to help share power and resources across state lines and really increase the resiliency of our communities and help connect more renewable resources to the grid. That's actually one of the issues currently plaguing Texas, is because of their isolation, there's no opportunity to share power across state lines that, can increase self-reliance, can be good if you want local control, but also leave you vulnerable to these types of situations. This bill is intended to help connect us with other locations to address some of those issues. There's a very wonky bill about updating, including energy storage in the way that renewable energy systems are currently taxed. Not a lot there. CRES supports it. I think it's just a necessary thing that needs to happen, but not a very sexy bill to look into. Another one, this has tended to happen since there's been a split in the legislature with Democratic control. There's always a Republican lawmaker who's trying to preserve the right to use natural gas and prohibit any restrictions being put in at the local level to promote things like electrification. We expect this bill to die in committee, and there's not much action that anyone needs to take, but we'll be keeping an eye on these and informing our membership if there are any actions or contacting their legislators that may be helpful in either stopping things that we don't think are particularly productive to CRES's mission or helping to advance those that would do the alternative. There's a lot yet to come this session. Updates to demand-side management programs and clean heating, a bill that would promote and include the use of renewable natural gas, permitting for solar systems, an exploration of community choice energy, also known as community choice aggregation, and whether or not that would be beneficial to Colorado communities, and also a bill that would help to establish a beneficial electrification investment program at utilities, similar to the way that utilities are permitted to invest in energy efficiency and now transportation electrification, and rooftop solar programs. This would be dedicated purely to cost-effective investments to help us move away from natural gas and towards more electric uses in the state. And my last slide and set of updates is about what's going on at the Public Utilities Commission. The ones that I picked out to talk about today, there are new rules that have been proposed for distribution system planning, which is exciting. Typically, a utility, if they need a new substation or transformers, they just go ahead and make those investments. Now, if there's going to be upgrades that are over $2 million or whatever the ultimate threshold is decided on, they'll be required to investigate things like, what if there was more rooftop solar and battery storage in this community? What are the alternatives to traditional investments that incorporate distributed energy resources that can actually help us have a more robust and carbon-free electric system. Xcel Energy has proposed new rates, and CRES and other organizations, Colorado Solar and Storage Association, are reviewing those and trying to identify opportunities where the way those rates are structured can be more complementary to deploying solar and getting more distributed energy resources onto the grid. And there's also an exploration of how that community solar bill credit is calculated and applied to your bill if you're a community solar subscriber. There have been a lot of steps to try to chip away at that value over the years. We want to make sure that it is robust enough to continue to support a growing marketplace and opportunities for solar either on your roof or in your community. I'll skip over the transmission certificate of public convenience and necessity, which just means Xcel is going to propose a new transmission line. Don't know a lot of details about it, but hopefully it's connecting more renewables. And in March, the big one to look out for that we'll be keeping you updated on, the next electric resource plan that will chart the path to an 80% decarbonization by 2030. Really exciting, but we just want to make sure that the investments that are being proposed aren't going to do things like, hey, let's build more natural gas plants that might become the next generation of stranded assets. How do we ensure that we're going as quickly as possible towards affordable, reliable, and carbon-free resources? And what are the configurations that are going to accomplish that? And with that, thanks for the opportunity to give my usual policy update, and I can't wait to hear Bob's talk. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great. Thank you, Johnny. Really appreciate that. So before we get started on our next our event tonight, I do want to just give a little pitch for our next event, which is in 1 month on March 18th. We will be talking about simulating climate change solutions with Stephen Moses. So he's going to take us through the En-ROADS model and to just walk us through how each of these variables within the model, which are obviously variables in real life as well, impact climate change and what levers we can pull to try to mitigate the impact of climate change and keep below a well below 2 degrees scenario. So very much looking forward to that. We'll also send the link out to the model so that you can play around with it and familiarize yourself with it before and during Stephen's talk, because you'll be able to manipulate it and play with the variables and get really in the weeds there with him. So I think that should be very, very fun, and looking forward to walking through that with all of you. And without further ado, I am so excited for our speaker tonight, Bob Litterman. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you have just tons and tons of expertise and have been relied on by very many people to speak to us about the climate change and climate change and how it impacts our markets and talk through that risk. So I will turn it over to you and just thank you again for joining us, and can't wait to hear more.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and let's just keep this relatively informal, and I'll be happy to take questions as I go through this talk. But what I really want to focus on is the role that the financial system can play. And there's 2 basic roles that the financial system is responsible for or needs to do with respect to climate risk. One is we have to help identify the risk, manage it, disclose it, and provide the information and the analytics that society needs to manage this risk. And the risk comes in different forms. It can be acute, it can be chronic, it can be a transition risk as well as physical risks down the road. And there are insurable risks, and most climate related risks are insurable, but then there are the systemic risks. And the systemic risks, you can't buy insurance. The only way that we can really insure the future generations against potential devastation from climate risk is to create incentives to reduce emissions. And they have to be strong incentives, and they have to be started immediately. We should have done this decades ago, and so I'll talk about that. But my most recent involvement in this policy landscape is started about 2 years ago when the Commodities Futures Trade Commission had an advisory committee, the Market Risk Advisory Committee, that was sponsored by one of the commissioners, Rostin Behnam, and they had some hearings on climate risk. I actually wasn't at those hearings, although I later was able to watch a video. But what was interesting is that the CFTC decided after those hearings to create a market risk subcommittee on climate-related market risk and to ask us to write a report. And a few months later, Commissioner Behnam came to me and asked me to chair that committee, which I was happy to do. And we spent over a year writing this report. We released it on September 9th, and it's gotten a very good reception. In fact, I'll actually be presenting that report to the Market Risk Advisory Committee next Tuesday, and I'm looking forward to doing that. We had in this report 53 recommendations for financial regulators and what they need to do to oversee the climate-related risk that will affect the financial markets. And the first recommendation of that report was that we need to put a price on carbon. Now, one of the things that was kind of interesting and fun about this is that the CFTC asked us, first of all, they created a very diverse group. There were 34 members of the subcommittee, and they ranged from really all of the stakeholders in the financial system. So you had banks, insurance companies, data companies, and other companies, but you also had oil companies on there, BP and Conoco were members of the committee. You also had the environmental community, the Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, World Resources. I'm on the board of the World Wildlife Fund. We're all represented. We had an awful lot of academics represented and expertise in risk management, sustainable finance. So a wide variety of folks. And then the commissioner and the MRAC asked us to come up with a consensus report. So they wanted a high-level report, lots of recommendations, and a consensus. Now, getting to consensus wasn't easy, but we managed to do it. And so this report really, I think, had a lot of impact, in part because of all the expertise that was represented. And it wasn't just the members of the subcommittee. We also had access to all the expertise within the organizations represented. We took that expertise and put it into the report. But what made it also powerful was that it was unanimous. So you had, everyone in the financial community. What was, I guess, interesting is, it's one thing if everyone recognizes that this is real and agrees on everything, but doesn't realize that we all agree on it. And it's another thing if we all agree on it and we say, by the way, we all agree on this. And that's really what we accomplished in this report. We said, look, we all agree on this. And one of the things, the most important, is that we put a price on carbon. And that's something that I've been focused on for more than 10 years. I used to be at Goldman Sachs, head of risk management there, and then later head of the quantitative investment group in the asset management division. I wasn't focused on climate risk at the time, but I retired about 10 years ago. And around the time I was retiring, one of my other partners asked me to lunch, and he said, Bob, are you interested in environmental issues? And I said, well, I am interested. My undergraduate major at Stanford was in human biology. And so I've been studying humans as, a social animal, if you will, for a long time. And, we understand some things about humans. One of them is that we respond to incentives. All animals respond to incentives. Incentives are very fundamental. And that's one of the things I learned as an undergraduate is if you want to understand human behavior, you have to understand incentives. In fact, the word incentives, it is anything that changes behavior. So if you want to change if you want to change behavior, you've got to change incentives. And in a modern market economy, the incentives that matter are primarily wages and prices. And the fundamental problem with respect to climate change is that we're not pricing the externality, the risk that's created when we release fossil fuel emissions, carbon emissions, or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's the fundamental problem. And, hopefully we all understand that. I like to tell people it's just a bug. It's like a bug in the tax code. And like bugs in computer code, once you understand them and you know how to fix them, you should fix them. And that's what we should be doing. The problem, though, is, and there's a lot of issues, a lot of barriers, but one of the big ones is it's a global problem. And we don't have a global governance structure. And each of the individual countries that's involved has a free rider problem, issue, I'll call it. And the issue is that if we want to clean up our pollution, it costs us money. If another country cleans up its pollution, we benefit, but it doesn't cost us. And every country sits around and recognizes that reality. And so we all have an incentive to say and promise that we're going to reduce our emissions and yet not do it, and hope that everyone else does their part. And that fundamental free rider problem has made it very difficult, and the lack of a global governance structure has made it very difficult to make the progress that we need. And so here we are, decades later than we should have, in terms of creating those incentives to reduce emissions. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize, and so I want to say it right up front, is that incentives come in many forms. So we often focus on carbon pricing or a carbon cap and trade system or taxes, but you also have lots of other incentives. And in fact, if you look globally at the biggest incentive to reduce emissions, and it's true in this country as well, it's not a carbon tax, it's gasoline taxes. Gasoline taxes are actually quite significant in terms of incentives to reduce emissions. And, if you own an electric vehicle, you don't pay them. Now, what is true, of course, is that they weren't instituted in order to reduce emissions. They were primarily instituted to pay for road maintenance and road building. But, if you ask the question at the margin, who has to pay and how much for emissions of greenhouse gases, it turns out that gasoline taxes are the largest incentive. Now, many countries also have subsidies to fossil fuels. So if you have a fixed price on gasoline and the market price globally is higher, you're ending up subsidizing, and those subsidies are quite large. The International Energy Agency has estimated them at hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And so incentives go both ways. In this country, you also have renewable portfolio standards, feed-in tariffs, and other subsidies to renewable generation. But again, the dominant incentive in this country comes from a gasoline tax, and it's just not big enough. There's a lot of ways to talk about how strong the incentive needs to be. There's various kinds of models. I've done some work myself with some other academics, and we published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science in 2019 with the title Declining CO2 Price Paths, because what we showed in that paper is that when you take into account risk, which most of the literature on this topic does not adequately take risk into account, the optimal thing to do is not to sort of ease on the brakes over a long period of time. That is a low carbon price today, rising slowly over time. And that has been the conventional policy prescription from economists. The right thing to do when you have risk and uncertainty is you have to create incentives that are strong enough today that you're able to deal with whatever gets thrown at you down the road. If you get some, bad outcomes. So if it turns out that it's more expensive to reduce emissions than we thought, or it's more expensive to pull emissions out of the atmosphere, direct air capture, than we thought, and maybe ecosystems are more fragile than we thought, or maybe there's going to be interactions between transition risk and the physical risks of climate change, and maybe those physical risks are worse than we thought. So in risk management, you're not interested or worried about the expected outcome. What you have to worry about in risk management is you have to worry about what's the worst case. And of course, in many contexts in the financial industry, for instance, there is no worst case. When I first came to Goldman, the partners asked me, "What's the worst case with respect to our swap book?" And it's like, well, how much could the market fall in a day or two, and how many of our counterparties could go bankrupt, and how much could they owe us? I mean, there's no definitive answer to that question. So in the financial markets, we come up with a probabilistic answer, something like value at risk. What do we expect to lose in the worst day of a year, or the expected loss on that day? There's various different metrics that you come up with, but they're kind of probabilistic. And when we talk about them to a lay audience, we say, well, you've got to worry about extremely bad but plausible outcomes. The 1 in 100 year or whatever type of event, the freeze in Texas. You got to worry about that if you're in risk management. You don't worry about the expected outcome. You worry about a really bad outcome. And with respect to climate, those really bad outcomes are existential threats to the future of humanity. We just, we haven't done this experiment before. And there are plenty of, call them tipping points or thresholds beyond which there's nonlinear responses. For instance, in the Arctic, in the tundra, there's CO2 that is starting to bubble up because it's starting to melt. And we don't really know how much is going to come up, but in terms of the carbon budget, which is a very narrow amount of CO2 that we can release and still keep the global average temperature below 2 degrees C, that's a small budget, and we're using it up very quickly. And we have uncertainty about some of these other sources, natural sources of CO2 that might be nonlinear and might get out of control. So those are the kinds of things that scientists are worried about, and we know how to solve it. And the answer is we have to create those incentives. They have to be strong incentives. And there's one simple way to think about it that I actually heard was attributed to Bill Gates, but it's an easy way to think about it, and I think a useful one. And that is to recognize that we are, everyone talks these days about getting to net zero, a rapid transition. Well, that's because we want to keep the maximum temperature to a reasonable degree. And that means this rapid transition has to happen very quickly. The problem is that even if we start today, and if we put very high incentives, over $100 a ton, the best case is we get to net zero by about 2050. Obviously, it depends a little bit on technology, and maybe it'll be better, maybe it'll be worse. I'm actually quite optimistic. So I think maybe we can get there earlier than 2050 if everything goes well. The problem is if it doesn't go well, and if it takes longer, then the maximum temperature is higher. And it's hard to say, but if we were to, I call it slamming on the brakes, create strong incentives immediately globally to reduce emissions, the maximum temperature is still likely to be well above 1.5 degrees C, maybe 1.7 or 1.8. And what's really scary is that for every decade that we wait until we slam on the brakes, that maximum temperature is about 2.5 to 3/10 of a degree higher. So instead of being 1.7 or 1.8, if we wait 10 years, it'll be 2 or 2.1 degrees C. And we really don't know where that cliff is. And sadly, if we had done this, 20 years ago, then the maximum temperature would be, we'd be almost there. Would be well below 1.5 degrees, but it's too late. We can't turn back the clock. And all we can do now is do it as quickly as we can. Now, the good news is there's a lot of evidence that we're getting very close to that tipping point where we actually create those incentives. And so I'll talk about a little bit about that. I mean, the CFTC report was one example of that. Everyone agrees we need to put an appropriate price on carbon. Shortly after our report, the National Academies of Sciences came out with a report on the road to net zero. And they said the same thing. We have to create a price on carbon. I'm the co-chair with Catherine Murdoch of something called the Climate Leadership Council, And we are the leading, proponents of the Baker-Schultz carbon dividend plan, which is a bipartisan plan to price carbon at a significant level. And that's likely to be introduced into Congress within the next couple of months with bipartisan support. It's going to be a steep hill to climb in terms of getting it. And I don't know if that's going to happen this year. We'll see how the debate goes. But if we look at it from a global perspective, the US is the biggest problem. Europe is well ahead of us in terms of understanding this, in terms of pricing emissions. If we look at comprehensive measures of incentives to reduce emissions, in France, which is the highest in the world, it's over $100 a ton. And so it's close to what we need. And by the way, they have very low carbon intensity in that country. In the US, we have higher carbon intensity, and we have much lower incentives to reduce emissions. With the gasoline tax and all the incentives we have on renewables, we estimate it comes to about $18 a ton, which is much too low. It's often said that there's no political party in the world other than the US Republican Party that is still in denial about the reality of climate change. I will tell you the truth. There's a minority of members of the Republican Senate that are in denial, but they don't want to speak out about it because Republican voters have been very disciplined about voting out of office Republicans who do talk about taking action on climate change. So even though they know that it's real, they know what needs to be done, and in general, they tend to support market approaches. Most of them are afraid to talk about it. Now, Lisa Murkowski, I'll give her credit, is probably the leading Republican senator, and Lisa's in some ways in a good position because the state of Alaska just approved ranked choice voting, which means that she is in a much better position to withstand a primary challenge. And so perhaps it's no surprise that she's helping to lead the charge. Mitt Romney and Susan Collins are also being very helpful. And there's probably a dozen other Republicans who, in the privacy of their own office, will tell you, of course, I get it. But, they'll say, Bob, what do you want me to do? If I speak out, I'm just going to get primaried and I won't be here. I hear you. I would love to provide leadership, but I'm not in a position to do so. And so, it's a tough political situation. Having said that, it's so much better than it was, let's say, even 6 months ago. If you think about it, the probability that we would get a Democratic president was very much up in the air. I think that the people thought very unlikely that we would get a Democratic Senate. In fact, the betting odds were about 20% or 25% as recently as 2 weeks before the election. And even if we got that Democratic Senate, the conventional wisdom was that would mean that Republicans would go right back into the totally partisan, will prevent any action on climate as they did under the Obama administration. And instead, what happened is, kind of the Republican Party went over a cliff. And it's totally in disarray now, which means there's a lot of volatility in the Republican Party. I don't even know if it can survive, frankly. And that means that those moderate Republicans are much more gettable than they would be if the Republican Party and politics in general was totally partisan. Now, it's not going to change overnight. This Republican Party thing is going to take a long time to resolve itself. But hopefully, in the meantime, we will be able to pick off, maybe if we get as many as half a dozen Republican senators, I think the Democratic Party would be much more inclined to go for a bipartisan solution. So that's what we're trying for at the Climate Leadership Council, and we're very focused on trying to get those Republican senators who know that they should be supporting market approaches, but haven't yet done so. And some of the things that you're seeing, that the Chamber of Commerce has changed its position. The Business Roundtable changed its position. National Association of Manufacturers. All these industry lobbying groups are evolving and changing quickly. The dark money that used to make it impossible for Republicans to support climate action is really drying up. You know, the leading disinformation think tank, I think it's called Heartland, they're running out of money. No one's giving them money anymore. And on the other side, the philanthropy behind the move quickly to net zero is just increasing dramatically right now. I mean, you've got so many billionaires now supporting this philanthropically. It's very exciting. So things are moving very quickly, and we see valuations reflecting this. I got involved in climate-related investments about 8 years ago as the head of the investment committee at the World Wildlife Fund. I've been talking about it for a long time, but at that time we addressed what many directors wanted to do, which was divest. And our consultant said, you know, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to divest of everything and clean it up. You can certainly reduce your exposures by divesting of this real resources fund that we had. And we did that, and we were left with less than 1% in our portfolio invested in what we called stranded assets: coal, tar sands, oil exploration, and production. And our consultant said, but you know, we said, that's not good enough. We want to get rid of all of it. And they said, well, here's a cost-effective way you can do that. And we came up with something we call the stranded asset total return swap. What we basically did is took all of our stranded assets and we updated this every quarter. And we sold the total return on those stranded assets to a counterparty in exchange for the total return on the market, the S&P 500. It was a very simple derivative overlay on the portfolio. I liked it for two reasons. First of all, it was very cheap. You can do these kinds of derivative overlays for basis points of cost. And then secondly, it was a very simple, and I thought very nice, clean bet. We're betting that stranded assets are going to underperform the market. And this is back in 2013. I thought, you know, that's a bet I would like to make. I don't know, but why not? And it's going to hedge our risk, and it'll get rid of our exposure to stranded assets and thereby align our investment portfolio with our mission. So we did that. Well, over the 7 years that we held that swap, starting in 2014, it outperformed, that is, the market itself outperformed the stranded assets by over 18% annualized. Now, 18% annual returns over 7 years is an amazing performance. It was better than any other asset in our portfolio. And that just shows, and many people aren't aware of the underperformance of stranded assets. They have collapsed in valuations. Coal, as an industry, collapsed, went bankrupt about 4 years ago, got recapitalized, and has gone bankrupt again. Now, I wouldn't short it, by the way, today, because it's so the valuations are so low that they bounce around, you know, up or down 20% a day, because it's basically, you know, just hit bottom. And similarly, the big oil companies, you probably read about Exxon dropping out of the S&P 500. I mean, if you're underperforming by so much every year, Exxon over a 7-year period's valuation went down by about half, whereas the market doubled. So you know, this is the kind of, when people talk about transition risk, we're already in the middle of that transition. And the reason we're in the middle of that transition is that investors are forward looking. So I talk about the importance of incentives, but let's be very clear. If you're building a power plant that's going to last for 40 or 50 years, you're not just worried about what are the incentives today. You're worried about what are the incentives to reduce emissions I'm talking about now. What are the incentives going to be over the lifetime of this plant? Similarly, if you're buying an internal combustion car versus you're making a decision between that and an electric, you're going to worry about what's going to be the cost of gasoline going forward, at least for 10 years. You may worry about the resale value of your car or whatever. So everything is forward looking in the investment space. And what's going on now is really exciting because you're seeing tremendous increases in the valuations of everything that has to do with moving rapidly to a low carbon economy. Just as an example, Tesla, you probably know, has been exploding in value. It's gone up since the low after the COVID pandemic started in March. It's gone up in value $700 billion. Now, if you look at Ford and GM, they've gone up over the same period by $90 billion. There's just no comparison. So this reflects expectations about carbon pricing, expectations about a rapid move to a low carbon economy, and it's not just Tesla. It's everything having to do with electric vehicles, with renewables, with carbon capture, everything, as I say, having to do with a rapid movement to a low carbon economy. You may have heard of SPACs. It's the new way of taking companies public, and clean tech is right at the center of this SPAC bubble is what it really looks like. So it's very exciting. I think it reflects all the good news. Now, there's a lot of good news in terms of how things are changing. Of course, there's a lot of bad news in terms of the situation that we're in. We absolutely do have to move very rapidly to a low carbon economy. And the only way that's going to happen is it's kind of an if and only if. We will move there if we price emissions, and we won't move there rapidly enough if we don't. Now, it's not, sometimes people get on my case. They say, Bob, you just think it's all about pricing. It's not all about pricing. It's about incentives, number one, and there's many types of incentives. And it's also about moving quickly along as many dimensions as we can. So we need regulation. We need the financial regulators, for instance, to oversee the disclosure of climate-related risks and so on. And we need to, as a society, focus on risk management. And that's going to be something that is true for many decades to come. One of the things that's obvious is that we're going to have to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for decades and decades. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but most scientists would agree that it's not just a matter of getting to net zero as soon as possible, let's say by 2050, but then we're going to have to be pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for decades and decades to try and get back as soon as possible to a stable environment. If the maximum temperature is 2 degrees, and that's not going to be healthy for ecosystems around the world, it's also a question of how long can you stay there. And we're probably going to have to get we're probably have to cool the planet down for decades after we reach the maximum temperature. Probably that will require solar radiative management as well as direct air capture. But when we think about what is the right incentive today, the way you probably want to think about it, an easy way to think about it is at the margin, we can create that ton of carbon dioxide and put it into the atmosphere. We're going to have to pull it out then at some point in the future. And what's it going to cost? We don't know. Today, the cost of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, there's cheap ways to do it, like planting trees. So don't get me wrong, there's some ways to do it, but all of those natural climate solutions are probably 10 to maybe 20% of the CO2 that we have to pull out of the atmosphere. So we're going to have to get to direct air capture at scale, at industrial scale. And the estimates are today that costs maybe $200, $250 a ton. Maybe in 20 years, we'll get it down to $100 or $150 a ton. And so you have to think about, okay, if we put a ton in today, we're going to have to pull it out in the future. That's going to cost, call it $150 a ton. I wouldn't want to charge more than the discounted value of that cost. So if I need to put $125 into an investment to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere 20 years from now, that's what I should be charging for someone to put it into the atmosphere. So it's a very high cost, and we need to get there as soon as possible. Now, I don't know, are there questions? I've been talking here for a while.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. This has all been very interesting, and the engagement on the question and answer box has proven that out. So one of the first questions is followed by a comment. So Doug appreciates your report, Managing Climate Risk in the U.S. Financial Systems, very thorough and complete, and thanks you for your service with the CLC. And his question is, how much influence does the CFTC have with officials in the Biden administration and in Congress? Is carbon pricing policy something that the CFTC would promote in the executive branch? And do you believe this is a policy they would promote in Congress? So I know you've already, touched a little bit on this, but that's from Doug.
Sure. Well, first of all, the CFTC is not the institution that you would have thought would create, this first report on how to manage climate risk in the financial system. You would have thought perhaps the Treasury or the Fed or the SEC. But, I have to give the CFTC a lot of credit because no one else was doing it. They had this, they had a bunch of experts talk to them, and they said, well, we're gonna do it. The field is clear. We're gonna do it, and so they did create this subcommittee. Now, in the broader context, the regulatory system for financial markets in the U.S. is really headed by the Treasury Department and something called the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. And so I'm sure that the FSOC will take the lead. And Janet Yellen has already announced that she's going to create a climate hub, have a climate czar in Treasury, and work streams to focus on this. So I think that's who's going to lead the charge. The CFTC, the SEC, the Fed, they're all members of FSOC. So they'll all be working together. But what's really gratifying for me to see is the all of government approach that this administration has taken. And I can tell you that, they've been in touch with me, the transition teams, they've been in touch with a lot of people in the climate community. One of the editors of our report, Leo Martinez-Diaz, is now part of John Kerry's team. So I don't think that going forward, the CFTC is going to play a particularly leadership role in this, but they're going to be part of the all of government approach that the Biden administration has rolled out.
Great. Thank you so much for that. The next question is from Ronald. Do utility boards of directors have duties to inquire about material risk? If so, what are the most material risks that utility boards should be inquiring?
Good question. And I would say that depends on the utility. Certainly, some utilities have very dirty power plants. And if they're coal-fired power plants, they should be shutting those down. Now, sometimes utilities have regulators that pass on the cost to their rate base. Pass on the cost through the rate base to their customers, and the customers can't, avoid that. And in those situations, the risks are different than a utility that has to compete with other utilities in a free market and can't pass on those costs. So, the climate-related risks associated with a particular utility or any company are likely to be relatively unique. Part of the risks have to do with where facilities are located. Are they in a floodplain? Are they on a coast? Are they in areas subject to wildfires? Those are the kinds of unique risks, climate-related risks, that companies have to deal with and have to disclose. But it's hard to say ahead of time for any particular company what those risks are going to be. And that's one of the things that makes disclosure of climate-related risks and management of climate-related risks so difficult? If I'm an asset owner with a big portfolio, I can't just look at the carbon intensity of every company in my portfolio. That may or may not be relevant. For oil and gas companies, for instance, and my firm is, we manage a fund that's designed to do well in the context of a rapid transition. So we're underweight fossil fuel companies, of course, but we also want to be long and short within those sectors. So which fossil fuel companies are going to do relatively well? And that has very little to do with their carbon footprint, because those oil and gas companies don't have a huge carbon footprint themselves. Now, they're what are called Scope 3 emissions are large. Those are the emissions from the automobiles that burn the gasoline that the oil and gas companies produce. But who's going to pay for that if we price emissions? It's the drivers of the cars that buy the gasoline. They're going to pay for it. And so what is true is that there's going to be a much lower demand for gasoline over the next few decades if we have a rapid transition. But the risk of that is the risk of a low oil price, not to the oil companies, not the risk of a high carbon price. And different companies have different exposures to low oil prices. So, for instance, a tar sands company that has a relatively high cost of production and uses a lot of energy in that production, so it has a relatively high carbon intensity, that may be out of business, especially if they haven't put the capital in yet and they have a break even at $70 a barrel of oil. Then that project is going to be worthless. Whereas, let's say Saudi Arabia, which can produce oil at a couple of dollars a barrel, if the price of oil goes down to $20 a barrel, they're going to be the ones who are still supplying the oil to the world. Now, they won't make as much profit, but they're not out of business. So if you're looking at relative exposure in the oil and gas industry, it's much more about the cost of oil, cost of production, then what the actual global oil price is, than it is their emissions directly. So those are the kinds of things that make climate-related risk analysis complicated, frankly.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, we've got about 10 more questions, so I'll do at least one more and then let me know if you would like to take more after that. Our next question is from Jennifer. What are your thoughts on carbon sequestration via regenerative agriculture and getting the fungi storing not just carbon, but also toxins? She's seen quite a few references to this interesting ability to lower greenhouse gases via regenerating the soil and getting plant coverage.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of opportunities. I'm not an expert, so I won't pretend to understand all the science of carbon sequestration in soil or other forms of carbon sequestration in natural systems, whether it's growing trees or preserving forests or increasing the soil, the carbon content of soils. These are all things that we should be doing for sure, and there should be incentives to do it. Now, with respect to farming and so on, maybe it's not by pricing. Maybe there are other mechanisms to create incentives to increase the carbon content of soils. I think one of the difficulties is actually measuring that carbon content. If we can measure it, then maybe we can create the incentives to increase it in the soil. But there are certainly a lot of ways to sequester carbon through natural systems like growing trees that are the most inexpensive. So in some sense, they are the low-hanging fruit. The issue with respect to them, and it's the only issue, is that there's just not enough. After we do all of that, we still have to do an awful lot more.
Great, thank you. And do you want to take another question or two?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Okay, great. So going back to Charles is asking, going back to your comments on the Republican Party, he's a liberal in finance and often discusses the ITC with a friend who's a conservative working in solar. And his friend argues that the ITC is actually a conservative policy because it's a reduction in taxes via credit rather than an appropriation of funds. So why do you think that more Republicans don't support this? Voter support, lobbying from fossil fuels, party line on policy. What are your thoughts?
Well, now the policy that you're talking about, what was it? ICC? I didn't quite understand
Oh,
the
I'm
policy.
sorry. The ITC, which is the federal tax credit for installing solar.
Oh
You get
yeah,
a
yeah.
26%. Yep.
Well, no, I think we should have these subsidies to solar. You know, that's a form of incentive, and so I'm in favor of all of the incentives. Uh, the issue, though, and this is a significant issue, is that we can't subsidize our way out of this problem. We just don't have enough money. When you talk about the scale of it, you know, in this country, what is there? There's like 5 gigatons of emissions every year. And, you know, if the appropriate price, the appropriate incentive is $100 a gigaton, I'm sorry, $100 a ton, and you've got 5 billion tons, you've got $500 billion is what it's going to cost, you know, if you charge $100 a ton. And if you want to subsidize it, so you're going to pay someone, you know, something on that order to reduce emissions, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And so that's, you know, you're going to run out of money. That's kind of the issue between subsidies and taxes. The other issue, and it's a very significant issue as well, is that it's kind of the difference between pulling and pushing. If you create a tax on emissions, that gives the right incentives to everyone to move in the right direction, whether you're an investor or a business person or a consumer. You face the appropriate incentive to reduce your emissions. If you're the government subsidizing, you're going to have to pick who you're going to subsidize. So I'll subsidize solar, I'll subsidize wind, I'll subsidize this, I'll subsidize, but it's not particularly efficient because you're only getting the people to move who you're subsidizing. So you're picking industries, you're picking technologies, you're probably, you know, and I'm, you know, a big fan of doing these things, all of the above, but they're not as effective. They're not, you know, they're more targeted, and they may be successful, they may not be. Whereas when you create the right incentives, everyone's moving in the right direction. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yep, that makes sense. And I think that one of the questions was, you know, one of the parts of the question was going back to the Republican versus Democratic philosophy. What do you think is the hesitation for so many Republicans to accept some of these incentive-based solutions or tax, you know, carbon tax, carbon pricing solutions?
Well, you know, the Republicans have, how shall we put this? You know, there was an entrenched industry here, the fossil fuel industry, that for the last 30 years has been subsidizing disinformation and making it hard for Republicans to face the reality of what's going on with climate change. So that's part of the problem. You know, you've really created this big lie. It's a little bit like Trump, you know, with the election, and it's going to take some time to change the Republican electorate and get them on board. Now, having said that, the Republicans have been voting for, you know, 45Q, for instance, subsidies and other subsidies, and I think it's very much, you know, depends on their state, their electorate, what particular policy that we're talking about. And I think they are moving in that direction. As you know, just last year, actually under the Trump administration, you remember there was a bipartisan bill that had a lot of subsidies for various forms of renewable energy and so on. So, you know, they're not doing enough. I certainly agree with that. And I think we all understand what some of the political difficulties have been. Hopefully those political difficulties are changing. When you ask the question the right way, should polluters pay? I think it's something like 70 or 80% of people say yes. It's very popular now. I think those Republicans are going to have to change. They, you know, the bottom line is they don't have a way forward. You know, they certainly can't move forward holding on to Trump. He's radioactive, and the moderates don't seem to be able to hold on to their party without him. So what are they going to do?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any good advice for them.
Yep. Thank you. That's great. And then I want to be sensitive to the flow of your time. Do you want to get back to talking? Do you want to answer more questions? What works best with you?
How about one more question? And then I'm going to go get some dinner. I haven't eaten yet.
All right, great. So our next question is from Becky. She says, Bob, thanks so much for speaking to us this evening. Today, a story broke about how much of the planned community housing stock in Texas may likely soon be worthless due to plumbing being located in exterior walls without adequate insulation against cold weather, such as Texas is now experiencing. I guess it will be insurance companies who absorb most of that bad risk, but surely the property insurance industry can't pass such risks onto its policyholders beyond a point. How do you see the construction industry evolving to minimize risk and the property insurance industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the reality is we should be incentivized to buy insurance and and face these real risks, these climate-related risks, whether it's the cold weather in Texas or the floods in the Midwest or the rising sea levels and hurricanes and other storms and hailstorms and wildfires. You name it. The weather is becoming more volatile. And these extreme weather events, heat events especially, that kill people are going to get worse and worse no matter what we do over the next several decades. So we have to be prepared for that. And a lot of it can be insured against. People should be, but what we have to worry about with respect to insurance is that we don't create bad incentives. For instance, the federal flood insurance program, which subsidizes flood insurance, and people build homes again and again in flood zones. They shouldn't be there. Similarly, in California, with the wildfires, and they're going to increase over the next several decades. It's a real problem here in terms of health impacts of that smoke, and also the structures that are at risk from wildfires. If you want to buy fire insurance in California these days, it's really expensive, or good luck. A lot of companies aren't even selling those policies. Now, there's a tendency to hope that the government will come in and say, no, you have to write insurance policies that are affordable. Well, that's a mistake. What we should do is have insurance policies that adequately reflect the risk, and then homeowners can make a decision: do I want to build in this fire zone or not? And I think that's what's going to happen. So what that means is certain places to live are going to be more expensive, and that's just the reality, and we should recognize it. And yet at the same time, we should do everything we can to make sure that it doesn't get so bad decades down the road. So we have to take immediate action to reduce emissions, and then we need to insure against those damages and those risks that are going to be increasing. And we have to build the infrastructure and do the adaptation that's necessary to deal as best we can to deal with the changing climate. It's not going to be good. It's going to be terrible. Let's hope it's not catastrophic. And let's recognize the reality of it and the fact that it's going to be much worse for our grandchildren than it is for us today.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really great. And I know you said one more, but I think this one is a perfect one to end on. I know you've hinted at some pricing, but what would you initially price a ton of carbon at? Is it that $100 threshold? Is it something different? And what would you rise it to in, let's say, 5-10 years?
Yeah, well, that is a great question to end on. I mean, I would say I think that the right price today is around $125 a ton, if you ask me. Now, I would also say let's get some scientists and some economists. In fact, there is a group that's doing a study now on the social cost of carbon, and the Biden administration has made that a priority. I think they want to get a reasonable number in 30 days, and then they'll probably spend a couple of years to get a better number. And I would suggest that they probably won't come up with a number over $100, but whatever they come up with will be a good start. And it's more important to get started than to get the right number immediately. But the other thing I would say is that when people ask, well, what should the trajectory be? We should focus on the expected trajectory. And, if we start at $40 a ton, the expected trajectory is going to be going up rapidly over time. But the actual trajectory will be a function of what we learn. And so if the data come in and there's cheaper ways to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere because of new technologies, the price can come down. But if it turns out that those technologies are actually more expensive than we thought, and the damages are worse than we thought, and ecosystems are more fragile than we thought, then we have to be prepared to raise the price. This is actually a problem in what's called robust optimal control. And our control is the price, the incentive that we create to reduce emissions. And we should react to new information. It's not optimal to pre-specify a path. You may want to tell people what you expect the path to be so that they can make plans. And people often say, wrongly, that businesses need to know. They need the assurance of what the price is going to be so they can invest appropriately. Well, guess what? The oil companies have been making investments in drilling for oil for decades. They've never had any assurance of what the price is going to be. That's just a false argument. So the reality is we should start high, and then we should react to new information. And again, I like to use the analogy of braking. And if you have perfect information and you know where you have to stop in the future, you can ease on the brakes. But if you don't know, and you might be going too fast and there might be a cliff up ahead, which is the situation we're in right now, you want to slam on the brakes and then, pay attention to what's happening.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights. I know that I learned a lot. And to those of you who still have questions in the queue, I'm sorry that we did not get to all of them this evening, but thank you again, Bob, for this. This was wonderful. I can tell by all the great feedback coming in that our members really have appreciated and learned a lot from you, and keep up the good work. Thank you for not just speaking with us tonight, but for all you do for us and our world in your everyday.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and good luck. And, thank you for all the good work that you and all your members are doing to try and create, this low carbon economy that we need.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a good night and go enjoy some dinner.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.